What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 great games that I, for various reasons, did not enjoy because I woke up today and chose violence. More specifically, though, this is a sort of follow-up to a video I did like a week or two ago, talking about a few games that were considered bad in some way that I nonetheless enjoyed. So that particular video got a bunch of comments requesting that I essentially do the opposite, talk about a bunch of very well received games that I, for one reason or another, did not enjoy so much. But right here at the beginning, I do want to stress that for the most part, I do genuinely believe all of these games are great games that for whatever reason just did not sit well with me in particular. I very much so think that the issue with these games is largely me, which is exactly why you're not going to hear any opinions in this video to the tune of how much I hated these games or something to that effect, but nonetheless I did not enjoy them on some level, so with all of that out of the way, let's actually dive into this and talk about it a little bit. Coming right out of the gate swinging, we first up have Planescape Torment, which might come as a bit of a surprise to people, as I'm kind of known as the CRPG guy. And Planescape Torment is one of the more beloved CRPGs of yesteryear. I've featured it in several ranking videos. I have a pretty old, admittedly, review of the game myself, and you've likely heard me praise it to some degree. If you've listened closely to those previous mentions I've made of this game, like pretty much everybody, I will tell you that the story is incredible. Planescape Torment's story is one of the best out there. Genuinely remarkable, moving stuff. However, what you'll likely not hear is anybody praising the rest of the game. The gameplay of Planescape Torment is not good, to say the very least. The combat system's a mess. It's technically a sort of adaptation of D&D, and it does not work. It's not really fun to engage with, and that's to say nothing of the later parts of the game that are clearly not even finished, which forms a, I would say, not insignificant barrier to that very incredible story that I mentioned. Plus, this is an older game, so that story is not even voice acted, which I know would be a huge complaint today, though it doesn't bother me in particular. Just simply thought that was worth noting. So that makes for an interesting case for this title, where, on one hand, yes, a story I think people should experience, but on the other hand, a game I simply do not enjoy actually playing. Which is a real shame, especially because here in the last, I would say, few years or so, a lot of narrative games have come out that have really pushed the medium of just using the game to tell a compelling story without trying to force things like a big combat system, etc. onto it that simply doesn't really need to be there to tell the story you want to tell. And that's the kind of thing that Planescape Torment could really, really use. Which brings us to our second entry on the list, which is actually Path of Exile, which, again, might come as a surprise to people because I do love a good ARPG, so what is one of the best of that genre doing on a list like this? Well, the thing about Path of Exile is that the endgame for me is simply not enjoyable at all. I've played through the game a few different times, I've made it to the end of it, and while I have fun enough, a lot of the advancement systems and coming up with a build are simply way more complicated than they need to be, and while that is the kind of thing that can provide somebody who's really dedicated to it dozens upon dozens of hours of simply experimenting before landing on something they actually want to use for the remainder of their game time, I'm personally not very wild about it, because a common thing you'll see with Path of Exile is people essentially telling you to go look up a build, use that, and then maybe, once you get used to that, start messing around and finding out things that work or don't. And to me, that's just not a compelling gameplay loop. If your system is that mechanically dense that people see it as a barrier to entry, it can cause a lot of other issues. And I say that because I know for a fact that's exactly how one of my favorite games also tends to make people feel. That is to say, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. That is a game with an incredibly high barrier to entry because Pathfinder 1e is so mechanically complex that people see all the options at character creation and they just nope out. So for me, Path of Exile tends to be a bit of a problem in the opposite direction. I can usually get through the story and have a lot of fun with it, but then I get to the end game, realize that what I've been doing up to this point probably isn't going to work. I see this huge list of options and I go, wow, you know what? I just don't want to do this anymore. And then I don't. And that's to say nothing of the constantly refreshed, let's say, mechanics being added by their seasons, And thus, for me, Path of Exile is kind of like if I were to eat a really good appetizer and then, for whatever reason, have no desire at all to even start the entree. Which is something that I'm hoping its sequel, Path of Exile 2, which I believe is aiming to have a beta release this year with a launch planned for 2025, last I heard. Though I will say it is the situation surrounding that why I've always been very patient and over the top in trying to explain how Wrath of the Righteous works to people and Pathfinder 1e as a whole, because I've certainly experienced those barriers to entry myself, which means I have to give a lot of props to the content creators around Path of Exile that go through the trouble of compiling all those information and builds, because I've bet they've managed to help people get over that barrier to entry many, many times over. But for me, that part of it's just never been terribly enjoyable. Which brings us to our third entry, Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I'll have to apologize here because I'm almost certainly only going to have a static image up because I don't have a capture card for my Nintendo Switch, and I certainly don't trust Nintendo not to try to claim my video if I simply pull a trailer or something. So while I don't talk about a great many of Nintendo's games on the channel, I have played a fair few of them. I own a Nintendo Switch, which admittedly at this point is mostly for my son. But nonetheless, I have played Breath of the Wild, obviously, and on one hand, I think it was really cool that they tried to advance what the overall franchise was all about, and I even think some of the ways that that world can be dynamic and interactive is a pretty cool thing to see. But I can't get over the feeling that Breath of the Wild is an incredibly empty world, filled with an insane amount of filler via its shrines, its Korok seeds, and a whole host of other things that are designed to make you feel like you are progressing in small incremental ways that then ultimately, in my opinion, just never really amount to much. Because yeah, sure, you can get a better horse, you can get more health, you can get more inventory space to deal with the weapon durability and your weapons constantly breaking on you, and you'll have to learn how to cycle weapons all the time around which one you want to use in certain situations. You'll even unlock certain abilities by completing the main story dungeons, and those dungeons themselves are admittedly pretty neat. You do all of those little things and make all of that progress, only to be drip-fed a story that frankly just isn't that interesting, with an incredibly predictable outcome because it's a Zelda game, and the entire thing just makes for a gameplay loop that I just did not enjoy. It certainly has its moments, there are individual little things I liked about it here and there, but mostly it's a game I just found exhausting to play with rewards that simply weren't worth the time investment, which is what it's doing on a list like this. Though that brings us to number 4, which is none other than Tunic. An interesting title, to be sure, that is sort of a blend of older Zelda titles, actually, with newer, almost Dark Soul-esque mechanics, set against a very charming, if not an outright whimsical background, that puts us in the role of a small fox where we have to learn basically everything there is to know about the world by assembling an in-game game manual that admittedly is a very novel concept. But once you get past that very novel concept, I just didn't have a lot of fun with it. Though I will say the combat was very good for an isometric Dark Souls, which isn't something you see too often. Normally that's pretty hit or miss, with the rest of the game basically just being a drip feed of information that they slowly reveal to you by showing you both the manual and simply learning how to solve puzzles. The problem with the puzzles, though, is that they tend to be pretty one-note. The vast majority of them simply are D-pad inputs, which the game refers to as the Holy Cross, and once the initial novelty of that wears off, it just wasn't really fun for me. I got kind of tired of it, mostly because it feels like once you learn those couple of things that the game is really holding back on you, like say the common ways in which it hides its secrets behind things that the camera view typically obscures in some way, or how the bulk of the puzzles work, like I mentioned, the game just doesn't really have much else to offer, and it simply wasn't enough to keep me interested, which means for a not insignificant portion of this one, I just wasn't having fun. But given its extremely positive ratings over on Steam, I think it's safe to say I'm the odd man out on that one. Which brings us to our final entry, which I do have to admit right away that I haven't played a ton of since it launched, and this is Dying Light 2. Now, the reason that's important is because this game has been seeing updates and things in the 2 years since it launched, and once it finally launches its second story DLC, which is supposed to be slated for this year, then I will be taking a second look at it. But speaking purely about the experience I had with it when the game launched, a lot of it felt like a very generic zombie RPG, which was a disappointing sequel for the incredible original Dying Light. So Dying Light, don't get me wrong, was itself a pretty janky game with plenty of missteps of its own, but in spite of that, managed to capture the feeling of trying to survive in this zombie-ridden city, which leads to all sorts of unique mechanics like their parkour system, how terrifying the nighttime could be. And then you have Dying Light 2, which came in and chucked pretty much all of that out the window. Dying Light 1 was a very light RPG. There were RPG mechanics, but they were not the be-all end-all of the game. Whereas Dying Light 2 leaned heavily into that, with all sorts of gear and items, with all sorts of stats and things you had to pay attention to. And the problem with that, in this context, is that those stats and gear that you now have kind of took away the feeling of how terrifying the nighttime could be. Because now I'm not being chased by some ambiguous monstrosity that's definitely going to kill me, but rather I'm being chased by enemies with stat blocks, which is a very different feeling. Which is pretty remarkable seeing how the second game removed guns, but still managed to make you feel more safe than with the game that had the guns. Though it's my understanding that guns are available in the game now, like I mentioned, launch and all that. And honestly, that's to say nothing of the pretty dull overall main story. That, as a total package, left me very, I would say, unmotivated. It's a game that felt like it lacked a lot of the identity that the original title had. Because say what you will about the original Dying Light's missteps, it was a very unique and memorable game. And Dying Light 2 just didn't really share that feeling, at least for me, which is why I didn't really enjoy it. But admittedly, again with the caveat that maybe they've improved some of this, which is the type of thing that I will be checking out for myself once they finally release that second DLC, so there might be a sort of follow-up video to this last entry later on this year. But for now, that is pretty much going to do it. There has been 5 great games that I, for one reason or another, have simply not enjoyed, which I fully admit in most of these cases is absolutely a me problem. So with that exact thing in mind, if you'd love to tell me how wrong I am about all of these, certainly feel free to do so down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.